This lecture is part of a 6-part video series that was recorded in 2011 and 2012 that I've never had the time to really complete and release the DVDs. So for the time being, I'm releasing this one lecture, lecture number 3 from the set, telling the story of how I returned to Catholic tradition.
I present to you Mr. John Vennari. Let's give him a warm Kansas City welcome.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Mr. Daly for the introduction, the Holy Name Society for sponsoring this, and of course the sisters, the Franciscan sisters, for letting us use this venue. I'm really grateful for this and for all of you coming out on a warm August afternoon. This is the third in a series of talks that we're giving about the crisis in the faith, and this one is called We're Not Going to Take It. And it's about Catholics resisting the modernist revolution. And I'm going to be coming at it pretty much starting with a personal story, because people sometimes like to know, well, it's like what you usually ask a married couple, how did you two meet each other? Well, amongst ourselves, we always like to know, well, how did you come into tradition, especially if you weren't born into it? My little story starts really in high school. I was a senior in Catholic high school in Philadelphia in 1975, 1976. I was in an all-male high school. As I said, the year is 1976, about 11 years after the close of the Second Vatican Council. And teaching theology that year was a young modern priest. I'll just call him Father Jimmy. It's not his name, but I'll call him Father Jimmy. Now, Father Jimmy was young. He was rather soft. He did have some good qualities. He was well-liked amongst the students. But he was trained and ordained in the post-Vatican II system. He had a modern approach to practically everything. And I had him for religion class my senior year. I had his class first thing in the morning, first period. And one day, towards the end of the school year, he said to us, okay, boys, tomorrow for first period for religion, don't come to class, because we'll go to the chapel and we're going to have Mass first thing in the morning. Because, of course, it was a Catholic school. They had a chapel on the first floor. And, of course, the new Mass was celebrated there. So there we were in the pew, and he's up saying the new Mass with Mass facing the people. Our class was there. We were the only ones who were there. And he's rolling into the new Eucharistic prayer, I think probably Eucharistic prayer number 2. And just before the consecration, he says to us, okay, boys, come up and form a circle around the altar. So you do what the priest tells you. So we all formed a circle, and he pronounced the words of consecration. And then when it came time to say the Our Father, Father Jimmy says to us, okay, boys, join hands. Now, we're high school boys. Seniors, we should be out on the football field knocking each other down and stomping on each other's heads and breaking each other's bones. And Father Jimmy's got us around the altar table. Okay, boys, hold hands. And we didn't know what to do, so we did it. And it was, Our Father, what's this going to be over? What's this going to be over? What's it going to be over? You couldn't say that, but and we were in the chapel, so afterwards we couldn't, go like this. So, and after that was over, we didn't speak of it. None of us talked about it. We just pretended it didn't happen. And I can safely guess that none of us spoke of it because we were mortified to the marrow of our bones. That's why I never talked about it. This was something that was embarrassing. It was effeminate. We went there for a Mass, and he turned us into this weird combination of altar boys and campfire girls. Now, if this was just one aberration from the 1970s, at a time when everything else concerning the faith was normal and healthy, we might be able to shrug it off. But what I talked about, that silly, effeminate, creative liturgy that we were put through, that type of thing was routine in the 1970s. And it became routine with the liturgical revolution that came from the Second Vatican Council. What I just described was merely another in a long line of aberrations that many of us had to confront when we were just trying to live as Catholics throughout the 60s and the 70s and the years afterwards. I was born in 1958. I was only 6 months old when Pope Pius XII died, and only about 4 years old when the Second Vatican Council commenced. So in my early years, this means I still had the pre-Vatican II sense of parish life, school life. The Old Latin Mass was the Mass that was celebrated in our parish. I mentioned this in the first talk I gave in this series. Our Sunday Mass in this blue-collar section of Philadelphia was packed to the rafters. We had 10 Masses every Sunday, packed to the rafters. So I spent 1963 kindergarten to 1976 in Catholic high school, Catholic grade school, Catholic high school. So this means I had a front row seat for the entire Vatican II revolution. I grew to maturity at the same time that the Vatican II revolution grew to maturity, if you can call it maturity, and I saw the entire sweep. When I was in first grade, I was learning the Kyrie. By the time I got to fifth grade, I was learning Kumbaya. When I was in first grade, the only thing that we saw from Sister Joan Labouré was her hands and her face. And by the time I got to eighth grade, I knew that Sister Kevin Leonard had red hair and varicose veins. So now around 1970, two things happened, one of worldwide importance and one of personal importance. The worldwide importance was, and that was around the time that the new Mass made its formal entrance into the world scene, into the Catholic world. And of personal importance was 1970 was the year that I started to play guitar. My father was a guitarist. He brought me home a guitar, and I started to play. And after playing guitar for only 3 weeks, I joined the guitar Mass, because I could join the guitar Mass only playing for 3 weeks, because in order to be in the guitar Mass, you didn't have to be any good. If you could just get through the standard 4-chord progression of a Bob Dylan or a Peter, Paul, and Mary song, you had all the talent required. So I lasted in the guitar Mass for about 2 years. Again, at the time, I didn't know any better. But one thing I did know, deep down inside, even though I couldn't define it, even as a youngster, I didn't like the new Mass. I would go there Sunday after Sunday, and what I saw, it was banal. It was cheap. It was dead. It was trendy. Do you remember the limp felt banners that used to be in the church? And they had these vapid sayings, God is love, or rejoice. Or even in the 70s, they had sayings from Jonathan Livingston Seagull. You know, the goal sees farthest, who flies the highest. Great. But there was something limp and artificial about this whole thing. Even though I couldn't define what it was as if to say, you know, I don't know how to tune a piano, but I know that piano is out of tune. I knew there was something about the new Mass that was out of tune. So by the time I ended up at that morning Mass with Father Jimmy holding hands with my school chums, I had already come to grips with the fact that something was drastically out of order. And one of the things I noticed that was out of order, you might have noticed this too, was the new practice that they introduced in the Novus Ordo offertory. The practice was that lay people would bring the water and wine up to the priest. I don't know what they're doing now. Maybe I don't know if they're doing that still or not. But I remember it in the 70s, and the priest would stand there. He would stand there, and the lay people would bring it up, and this was lay involvement. It was the active participation of the faithful that the modern liturgists were all gung-ho about. I think you know the difference, right? The difference between a liturgist and a terrorist. You can negotiate with a terrorist, all right? So here is this lay offering of the bread and wine that they forced it upon us. And I remember in the parish church, there would be a little table set up in the church I went to. There was a little table set up with the water and wine, and I always noticed that there was a swath of empty pews around that water and wine table. Nobody wanted to be there, because if you sat there, it's likely that you'd be called upon to take part in this little thing. And there was another parish church I went to. They put the center aisle here, and they put the water and wine on the table right in the middle of the aisle. And again, when you walked in, you could see the empty pews went right around it. People didn't want to do that. And during the Mass, there would always be that awkward moment where the priest and the altar boy would just stand there and wait, an eternity long stage wait. And finally, some mother would nudge her son, and they would get up and get the water and wine, and he'd be in shorts and sneakers and a Leonard Skinner T-shirt, and they would go up and deliver the water and wine, and the ceremony would continue. So, seeing that, again, even as a youngster, something inside of me that said, this is not right. There shouldn't be silliness in the worship of God. There shouldn't be trendiness. There shouldn't be awkwardness, empty ceremonies. So what really told me, though, that there was a crisis of faith in the church of colossal dimension is what I encountered in my 4 years of Catholic high school. Again, all-male Catholic high school. Because when I was in high school, I was conscious of the reality of mortal sin. I really had a fear of mortal sin. Not a scrupulous fear. I mean, if you knew me back then, I wasn't particularly pious. But I did stay on the right side of mortal sin. And that's the reason I went to Mass every week. Because if you miss Mass purposely, it's a mortal sin. And if you die in the state of mortal sin, you go to hell forever. I mean, forever. How do we even contemplate forever? The best we can do is think of it in terms of time, of millions and millions and billions and billions and trillions of years, and that's just the beginning of it. Our Lord said, "Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire that is prepared for the devil and his angels." So, I knew if I deliberately miss Mass on Sunday, it's a mortal sin. If I die in the state of mortal sin, I go to hell forever. So I figured it's not worth it. I'll go to Mass. But it was this consciousness of mortal sin. It was this fear of mortal sin that told me, while I was in high school, that told me there was something was out of order. There was some sort of crisis of faith going on. And this is because during my entire 4 years of Catholic high school, I was surrounded by a teaching order of priests, supposedly Catholic priests. Sin was never mentioned. Sin was never talked about. And of course, mortal sin was never talked about. Neither was sanctifying grace. It was the entire element of the supernatural was just drained from anything that we were given. And as in every age, and especially in the 60s and the 70s, these high school boys needed to be told about mortal sin, especially, I'm not going to go into details, but especially regarding the 6th and 9th commandment. And what was worse is we had some young priests, I can name 2 of them, I won't name them, but 2 of them, who told the boys, look, you and your girlfriend can carry on like husband and wife, providing you love one another. That's when sin was mentioned, to tell us that there was no sin. So we were told this. All these various sins were no longer sins. And I guess, I don't know who it was, but I guess I had somebody praying for me back then. Because even as a high school boy, I never thought, Father says it's not a sin, so he must be right. And I used to think, he's crazy. These people are nuts. I mean, how could you say these are not sins? My parents did have a handful, not a lot, but a handful of pre-Catholic books, pre-Vatican II rather, books around the house. And I would always read through these books, and I would find that what I was learning in Catholic school was the opposite, often the opposite of what these pre-Vatican II books were teaching, and I always believed the books because they simply tallied with common sense, and they tallied with a Catholic conscience. So what did we learn in religion class? Well, not a whole lot, and certainly not what I was looking for, which was the true Catholic faith. The Catholic faith I'd been reading about in the books my parents had at home. This is the type of thing that would happen in religion class and CYO. I'm sure some of you went through it. These little group sessions. What does love mean to you? What does charity mean to you? What does neighbor mean to you? But one episode stands out in my mind, and that was when I was a junior in high school, and I wrote a letter to the school newspaper complaining about the religion classes that we were getting. That year for religion, I had a priest, I'll just call him Father Dusty. Father Dusty was renowned for being extremely boring. He was, when people heard I got Father Dusty, oh, great, he's very boring. When you walked into his class, there were 2 blackboards full of notes. and you would spend a good part of the class copying them out, and then he would erase them all and then fill them up again. And you would, and his course required a lot of study, which I have to confess I didn't do. So I didn't do much of. But what he was teaching is he was teaching Paul's missionary journey, and he taught it as a dull, boring exercise in history. Paul went to Perge, and from there he went to Pisidia, and then he went to preach at Antioch. Blah, 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 blah. It was a dry history course with no moral drawn from it, no dogmatic teaching drawn from it. And what I mean by this is, even if you would want to teach Paul's missionary journey from the standpoint of history, you could make a digression into what's taught there. For example, there was never any digression into 1 Corinthians 11, Paul, but let a man prove himself, and so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup. For he who eats and drinks unworthily without distinguishing the body of our Lord eats and drinks judgment to himself. An opportunity to tell us, don't make sure you're in the state of grace when you receive communion. No digression into Romans 1. For this cause God has given them up to shameful lusts. For the women have exchanged the natural use for that which is against nature, and like manner the men, abandoning the natural use of women, have burned in their lust towards one another, men doing shameful things, and calling this a perversity. And that needed to be reminded. No reminders. No reminders from Romans 12, where St. Paul says, do not be conformed to the world. No reminder from Romans 2, where St. Paul tells us that there was a natural law written in men's hearts, and we know that when we have transgressed it, and even pagans know when they have transgressed the natural law. No reminders from 1 Corinthians. Know you not, Paul says, that the unjust shall not possess the kingdom of God. Do not err, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor the effeminate, nor liars, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor railers, nor extortionists shall possess the kingdom of God. Again, young boys in their teenage years into adolescence, they need to hear these things. We weren't given it. And we didn't even receive, even if you want to just teach the positive, we didn't even get Ephesians 1, that whole beautiful teaching of where St. Paul tells us that we are adopted children of God. We are adopted sons of God, which is a basis for the entire Catholic doctrine of sanctifying grace that's given to us through baptism and the sacraments. No, that's not what we got. What we got was St. Paul went to Ephesus, and he stayed there for a few years, or then he went to Macedonia, and then he went to Corinth. Now, I am caricaturing, but not by much. And I was so annoyed by this, as I said, that I wrote a letter to the school newspaper decrying the empty religion courses that were being given. The emphasis was placed on history, not theology. Sin was never talked about. And when I sent my letter in, I wrote it down that it was from me, but I did say, if you publish this letter, I would prefer it says name withheld. I would prefer that. Don't put my name on when it's published. I ended up in front of the head guidance counselor because of that letter. I'll just call him Father Ralph. The head guidance counselor of the entire school, because each grade had their own guidance counselor. I ended up with the man at the top. Now, Father Ralph was very kind, and he said, Mr. Vennari, you obviously feel very strongly about this. I wanted to say, why don't you? But you feel very strongly about this, but we will not print your letter in the school newspaper unless you put your name on it. Without your name, it won't be printed. And at that point, I'm ashamed to say, I said, well, then don't print it. I withdrew the letter. Now, why did I say that? Was it because I was afraid of being teased by my high school chums? Not really. No. And the ones close to me, I had talked to them about this type of thing. I wasn't worried about that. The reason I didn't want the letter printed under my name criticizing my religion course, because at the time I was failing religion. Father Dusty's course on Paul's missionary journey, as I said, consisted of this great accumulation of facts, and I just didn't study to commit it to memory. So that kind of undercut my moral leverage. But more so, If I failed religion, there was a consequence to this, because if I failed religion, that meant I would have to go to summer school. And that's the last thing I wanted to do, because I told you I was a guitarist. By that time, I was playing professionally in nightclubs. And my band, the band I was with, this big 8-piece band with, horns and all this type of thing, we were slated to work at the Jersey Shore all summer. And if I went to summer school, I would have to go to them and say, well, you have to find another guitarist. So, as I said, I withdrew the letter. When push came to shove, I withdrew the letter. I still had a good bit of maturing to do, and I did finally pass the course by the skin of my teeth. But the 4 years of Catholic high school, in which the religion classes were abysmal, and which was capped off by Father Jimmy's Mass with us holding hands together, that's what told me that there was some sort of crisis of faith in the church. And I really learned my faith once I got out of Catholic school. After I got out of the Catholic school, I began to say the Rosary, which was never talked about. I became devoted to the Infant of Prague, and the promise of the Infant of Prague is, the more that you honor me, the more I will bless you. It's a promise I found very true in my life. And I became interested in this time in Our Lady's Message of Fatima, and as you know, that's always a life-changing endeavor, learning the message of Fatima. But in this pursuit of trying to learn my faith better, it was in 1977 that I came upon a pamphlet that told me, first time I saw this, that told me that the new Mass was written with the help of 6 Protestant ministers. There was that famous picture, you're going to see it in the next talk, the famous picture of Paul VI with the 6 Protestant ministers who helped write the new Mass. So the new Mass was actually built on Protestant principles, similar to what Cranmer built his liturgy on. I went through a detailed explanation of this in the previous lecture when I was here before. I won't do it again here. But the 6 Protestant ministers, we know their names: Dr. George, Canon Jasper, Dr. Shepherd, Dr. Coneth, Reverend Eugene Gran, and Max Therium. And the direct involvement of these Protestant ministers in the drafting of the new Mass was confirmed by Bishop William Baum. He later became Cardinal Baum. And he told the Detroit City Press, June 27, 1967, he said the Protestants were not there simply as observers, but as consultants as well. And they participated fully in the discussions on Catholic liturgical renewal. It wouldn't mean much if they just listened, but they contributed. So the new Mass, the Novus Ordo, the Mass in every parish church and religious house in the world was written with the help of 6 Protestant ministers. I'll tell you, as in 1977, that floored me. And I remember thinking that if imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, why do our church leaders imitate men who reject bedrock teachings of the Catholic faith, such as the sacrificial nature of the Mass, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the sacramental priesthood established by our Lord? But one thing it did tell me is that then it all made sense. This is why I don't like the new Mass. It's a Protestant and ecumenical. It's Protestant and ecumenical in its construction. It is not truly a Catholic form of worship. And as I said, I went into this in detail in the previous talk. And it was also in that little pamphlet that I learned for the first time that the Old Latin Mass could never be forbidden because of a crucial papal bull by Pope St. Pius V called Quo Primum. Now, as I said, I had never heard of this before. Pius V issued this on July 14, 1570. And it was Quo Primum that Pius V decreed that no priest could ever be forced to celebrate anything but the Old Latin Mass, and that those who tried to change the Mass would incur the wrath of Saints Peter and Paul. Here's the quotes from Quo Primum. Specifically do we warn all persons in authority of whatever dignity or rank, cardinals not excluded, and command them as a matter of strict obedience never to use or permit any ceremonies or Mass prayers other than the ones contained in this missal. At no time in the future can a priest, whether secular or order, ever be forced to use any other way of saying Mass. And in order once and for all to preclude any scruples of conscience and fear of ecclesiastical penalty and censures, we declare herewith that It is by virtue of our apostolic authority that we decree and prescribe that this present order and decree of ours is to last in perpetuity, and never at a future date can it be revoked or amended legally. See, this is the full weight of apostolic authority teaching here. And he closes, therefore, no one whosoever is permitted to alter this notice of our permission, statute, ordinance, command, precept, grant, indult, declaration, will, decree, and prohibition. Should anyone dare to contravene it, let him know that he will incur the wrath of Almighty God and of the blessed apostles Peter and Paul. All right, that's quo primum. Now, for those who maybe didn't live through this in the 70s, I can't tell you what a lifeline that was for those of us who were determined to preserve the old Mass. This gave us the moral foundation on which to hold on to the true Mass, even against the explicit wishes of the bishop, even to resist the open hostility of the local bishop. And we would learn, too, that we had more. It wasn't just quo primum. We had more than quo primum on our side, but this was a central document in the struggle. So quo primum is telling us that that a priest needs no special permission from the bishop, no special indult from the bishop, no indult from the Ecclesia Dei Commission, and the faithful need no special permission to attend it. And Father Paul Kramer, he takes it a step further. He argues from the doctrinal teaching of the Council of Trent and also from the profession of faith of the Council of Trent that the Mass could not be changed and substituted with a new rite, even if quo primum had never been written. Because the profession of faith of the Council of Trent tells us that as Catholics we are bound to adhere to the received and approved rites of the Church in the Mass and in the sacraments, and the received and approved rites are contained in the traditional Mass and the traditional sacramental formulas. You all know, of course, the Tridentine Mass is not the Mass of the Council of Trent. That's just when it was really, codified and carved in stone, as it were. But it's the Mass of all time from the beginning. And also, we see that anyone who would alter the Mass would incur the wrath of St. Peter and Paul. And recently I came upon a sermon from an old traditional priest in 1974, and he basically said, and this is something we need to think about, he said, you want to know why the church is upside down? You want to know why the church is in chaos? It's because our leaders have changed the Mass. They disobeyed this direct order, and, as Pius V said, we are now under the curse of St. Peter and Paul. So in any event, I wanted to go to the Old Mass, and I couldn't get there because of my work schedule. I finally got to the Old Mass around 1980. It was the same time that I quit playing in nightclubs. I came to see that this is incompatible. I mean, I wanted to be involved with the fight for the church. I wanted to be out there doing things, and at night I'm on stage, boogie, oogie, oogie, oogie. And, it was just, I had to get out of that lifestyle. But during this time, 1977 to 1980, when I was searching for the new Mass, it was at this time that I learned that there were Catholics throughout the country and throughout the world who had resisted the new Mass. I never knew of that before 1977. I learned, for example, that in my area in Philadelphia, there was a Latin Mass chapel just outside of Philadelphia in Feasterville. And I learned there was a Mass celebrated in a hotel room out near the Philadelphia airport. I learned that throughout the country and throughout the world, the old Latin Mass was being preserved by priests and lay people. The Mass is being celebrated in garages, in basements, in old Protestant churches that people had bought, in rented fire halls, rented VFW halls. And it was here that I learned about a French archbishop named Marcel Lefebvre, who was the one bishop, I remember it struck me back then, the one bishop who publicly took a stand against the true Mass and took a stand for the true priesthood and the true faith. Now, in the early days, the mid-60s, throughout the 70s, even apart from Archbishop Lefebvre, there were a handful of dedicated priests who recognized their duty to resist the new Mass, to hold on to the old Latin Mass, and they fought without compromise. And for some of you, I think I'm going to be dipping into the waters of memory, mentioning some names that perhaps you haven't heard in a long time. For those of you who are younger, it may be the first time you hear of these men who were fighting in the very beginning. There was a priest named Father Gomer de Paul from New York, certainly one of the first traditional priests in the United States. His battle started even before the new Mass. He incorporated the traditional Catholic movement in 1965, and he kept to the old Mass. He didn't go along with any of those transitions that were happening between 1965 and 1970, the Mass turning around, the Confiteor in English, more and more vernacular. He kept to the old Mass, and he received the written encouragement from Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani. Another early priest was Father Francis Fenton, not Monsignor Joseph Clifford Fenton, the one whom I quote all the time, the theologian, but Father Francis Fenton. He founded something called the Orthodox Roman Catholic Movement, the ORCM. Does anybody remember the ORCM? We have some people. Yes, and this was a nationwide, a loose association of traditional priests throughout the country, people such as Father Robert McKenna, Father Videlmer. Now, these groups, of course, had their troubles. Some of the priests had their quirks. Father de Paul had a reputation of being difficult to get along with. I was told this by a number of priests. And some of the ORCM priests, such as Father Fenton, some of them became sedevacantists, and some of them became sortivacantists. Sedevacantism is the belief that we have no pope. Sortivacantism is what I call those who have bought this theory that, well, we have a material pope but not a formal pope. And, I don't agree with those positions. So, and by the time we get to 1980, the ORCM had pretty much dissolved. It was a thing of the past. But the priests did a lot of good work in the beginning. There was Father John Keene in Boston, who had traditional chapels as early as 1971. He was very comical. He had a radio show that he used to make fun of the new Mass, and the local bishop used to listen to it because it was so entertaining. He founded, he used to give advice for the kiss of peace, keep away from people who are eating garlic, that type of thing. And he served and founded at least three, I think, I can be corrected on this, at least three traditional chapels in the Massachusetts area. There was Father Francis LeBlanc. He died fairly recently. Early pioneer, never said the new Mass. He only said the Tridentine Mass. And of course, in the 1970s, we saw the arrival of the early priests of the Society of St. Pius X, Father Hector Bolduc, and you remember those names. And of course, these priests and chapels were severely persecuted by their local bishops. The bishops would declare that these priests saying the Tridentine Mass were suspended, even though this was a complete abuse of authority. A priest can only be suspended for committing a sin, for committing a crime, and their only crime was fidelity to the past. So none of these suspensions were valid. None of these were valid. And we know also from the saints and the doctors of the Church that we have a duty to resist. I'll just read one of them. Father Suarez, the great Suarez, the Counter-Reformation theologian. He says, if the Pope gives an order contrary to good customs, and the Mass is contrary to good customs, new Mass, if the Pope gives an order contrary to good customs, he should not be obeyed. If he attempts to do something manifestly opposed to justice and the common good, and the new Mass and the new theology is manifestly opposed to justice and to common good, if he attempts to do something manifestly opposed to justice and the common good, it will be licit to resist him. If he attacks by force he can be repelled with a moderation appropriate to a just offense. Okay, now there was also someone who's not so well known, but I knew him well, Father Marian Palandrano. Father Marian Palandrano was a traditional priest who only celebrated the Old Latin Mass. He was ordained in 1949. He had the goods on what Vatican II was all about from the very beginning. He never said the new Mass, never went along with it. He celebrated Mass just outside of Philadelphia, and also when I was going to Mass at the chapel in South Jersey, he said the Mass there for a good 10 years. As I said, I got to know him well. He was ordained, as I said, in 1949. He went to a seminary in Ohio, some missionary order, even though he came to be he came to do parish work. But he was very well trained. I used to call him a theology machine. You would ask him a question, it was like pushing a button. And you got a two-stage answer. At first, you got a perfect textbook definition of whatever theological point you asked about, and then you got a very simple, flat-footed, easy-to-understand explanation of the doctrine. He was magnificent. But he told you, and he's a great preacher too, but he told me that on the day after his first Mass, 1949, one of his seminary professors came up to him and said, "Father, you might as well forget everything you've learned, because in 10 to 12 years, it's all going to be changed." That's 1949. As I mentioned in the previous talks, the ones I gave here in April, the liturgical revolution, the new theology of the Vatican II revolution had all been in the works for the decades prior to the Second Vatican Council. Vatican II was just the geyser that brought it up to the top. And to get some of these priest stories, I would recommend a book published by the Angelus Press called Priest, Where is Thy Mass? Mass, Where is Thy Priest? You see what these priests went to, especially in the seminary, because at this time, if a seminarian would stay too long in the chapel or pray the rosary or make a holy hour by himself, sometimes he would be told that he needs psychiatric counseling. I mean, the seminarians were persecuted who wanted to be traditional. And a common stigma, as I said, that was inflicted on these priests, most of them, not all of them, is that they were suspended by their bishops. Their chapels were publicly denounced by the local bishop, by the diocesan newspaper. Sometimes a bishop would take the time to make sure that a letter was read in every parish in the diocese, warning people to stay away from this chapel. They're irregular, they're suspended, they're outside the church, they're disobedient, they're rebels. And this is where we really saw what I call the diabolic inversion, because bishops throughout the country would either allow or encourage one liturgical abuse after the next. They would allow open heresy, immorality to be taught in the seminaries, in the colleges, in the universities, in the high schools, grade schools. That was fine. And these priests remained priests in good standing. They remained the teachers teaching the heresy, teachers in good standing. But those who kept to the true Mass, the true faith, were denounced and vilified. Now, this caused a tremendous amount of suffering for those faithful Catholics trying to maintain the faith and their adhesion to the true Mass. The denouncements of these local bishops split families apart. Lifelong friendships were blown apart. And this is what I call the crime of fidelity. The crime of fidelity. And it was similar to what Catholics suffered in the 4th century during the Arian heresy, where it is said that 80% of the bishops fell into the Arian heresy. And at that time, St. Basil the Great said, this is a famous quote, you remember Michael Davies writing about it, using this quote, "Only one offense is now vigorously punished, an accurate observance of our fathers' traditions." So these Catholics had their Catholic world swept away. Suddenly there was the sacrilege of communion in the hand. Suddenly their Mass was changed into something that resembled a Protestant service. Suddenly their children were coming home from Catholic school saying that it's not a sin to miss Mass on Sunday, or that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels, were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and what's in the Bible is not really history, just pious fables, and you can be saved in any religion. I mean, you've heard it all. And a lot of these good Catholics, and there's probably people who did this very thing, they went from parish to parish to parish to parish, trying to find at least one good priest, even in the Novus Ordo system, that would give them the real thing, and they would end up at the Tridentine Chapel, set up against the wishes of the bishop who was giving them a counterfeit religion, counterfeit Catholicism, and a counterfeit Mass. And the same thing, of course, happened in education. And this is what caused the massive growth of Catholic homeschooling that really took off in the 1980s. I went to a homeschool conference in Kentucky a few years back, and I did a survey. I asked the parents, what was it? What was it that made you homeschool? It's kind of, what was the final straw? So most answered it was because of the bad religion classes, and also a lot because of the abominable sex education classes. Father Wickens in New Jersey, he was suspended by his bishop, quote unquote, because he opposed these awful sex ed programs. One woman told me that her second grade daughter was scheduled to be in a Christmas play. And that's all well and nice. But then she learned the play was going to be performed on the parish church altar or whatever it had become once they took down. She pulled her children out of school, began homeschooling. One mother had her young daughter come home, this was from public school, saying, "My teacher says if you hit me, I can sue you. I can take you to court." Pulled out of school pretty quickly. Then one mother talked about a situation in a Catholic school where the religion class was being taught by a young woman who was pregnant and out of wedlock. She's teaching religion. And when the mother finally did marry, she didn't marry the father, somebody else. But this one woman made a good point. She said, teachers are not just teachers. They're role models. And children are not so much influenced by what you say, but how you live. So she said this was completely inappropriate. She pulled her children out. And of course, a number of parents told me that they pulled their children out of Catholic school when it was time for their children to receive First Communion, because they were told the only way to receive is communion in the hand. So, and for decades, as you know, up to the present, the Vatican has done virtually nothing to correct these problems, to correct these abuses. They put out a document here and there, but it never has any teeth. And in fact, I had the opportunity to visit the Vatican a couple years ago and speak to a Vatican cardinal about this very problem. At the time, this is in about 1994 to be exact, I was with a group. We were trying to start a religious community, and we went to the Vatican's Ecclesia Dei office to find out firsthand what this Ecclesia Dei office is all about. We're not going to read about it. We're going to go there and see what they have to say. I went with the man who was the head of the religious group. It was the two of us who traveled to Rome. Again, this is January 1994. So in the process, we spoke with one of the Monsignori who worked at the Ecclesia Dei office. That's a story in itself that's rather funny. But we also had a private meeting with Cardinal Augustin Mayer. Cardinal Mayer, who was the first prefect of the Vatican's Ecclesia Dei Commission. And we met with Cardinal Mayer in Rome in his apartment. We didn't even meet him at the Ecclesia Dei office. He invited us to his apartment. He was soft-spoken. He was polite. He was urbane. He was European. He was a very kind man. And he said to us, he said, don't concentrate so much on the negative. There are many positive things going on in the church. And I said, like what? And what he did is, it was rather, he pointed to isolated spots on the globe where good things might be happening. I go to convent in Mexico, many vocations, and the monks in La Barue, France, doing very well. So I said, well, I was very respectful, and I said, well, Your Eminence, on the street level, Catholic parents by the thousands are pulling their children out of Catholic school and at great personal sacrifice are teaching them at home because they can't trust the curriculum that their Catholic bishops are giving them. So with that, he stood up, he disappeared into his library, he came back with a typewritten, unpublished manuscript. It was written by a housewife from Midwestern United States. It was called Catholic Sex Education is an Oxymoron. And he got it, and he dropped it on my lap, and with a great big smile, he said, see, there are good things happening in the church. A book written by a housewife, not even published. It was a manuscript. See, the Vatican has the power, the authority, and the inescapable duty to torch these sex education people right out of the classroom, and this cardinal wants a housewife to do his fighting for him. The faithful were left to fend for themselves, so I could continue with story after story after story of Catholic parents struggling, fighting, for no other reason than to preserve the faith as it has always been taught, preserve the Mass, and those people suffered because they were the ones, to this day too, we are the ones who are looked upon as the transgressors. In fact, this is the final story I'm going to tell. I mentioned earlier the crime of fidelity. I'll give you an example of the brutality of this from the Diocese of the Church of the New Springtime. I'm thinking of an episode that took place in South Jersey in 1980. It's the chapel that I used to go. I attended in 1980, the traditional mass there. And there was a man there. In fact, I never met him. This happened the week before I started going there. So I never met this man, but everybody was talking about it when I went there. His name was Dan. Now, Dan had been a pillar of his parish all his life. Dan had built the parish. He was a very generous man. He pretty much built it, and he suddenly died. Now, the parish knew this. The bishop knew this. They were well aware, but after he died, the bishop, the chancery, contacted the family and said that Dan was not allowed to be buried in a Catholic cemetery. He was not allowed to be buried because he attended that Old Latin Mass. So you can imagine the pain, the suffering that this caused the family. They're already reeling from his death, and then to see the husband, the father of the children, to be disgraced at death, considered a reprobate. But this is the type of thing that traditional Catholics have continuously suffered since the imposition of the new Mass and since the imposition of Vatican II's new program. Now, I want to make it clear that I'm not telling you all these things in order to try to establish some sort of victim status for traditional Catholics, a kind of poor, poor, pitiful me type thing. No, I'm relating the things that I related because those who had the grace to grow up in traditionalist families, after their parents had already been through all of this, the young people who had the grace, and I say the grace, the young people who had the grace of growing up in traditionalist schools, they need to know the intensity of the battle and that this battle is still going on and it needs to be fought. And we need to recognize and inculcate the need for militancy against the crisis of faith, the present crisis of faith, because the crisis, the modernist program of the Council, is becoming more and more institutionalized. It has settled into a kind of what I call, especially under Pope Benedict, however you want to say it, a conservative modernism or a modernist conservatism. It's still a new structure, something Pius X, Pius XI, Pius XII would not recognize. But if we have grown up in, say, a Society of St. Pius X school, and maybe we've been protected from the horrors of the battle, although it's a tremendous blessing, perhaps it's a blessing for some, not all, but for some that's not really appreciated. Maybe they've just never thought about it. It's a blessing that's not recognized. And even, I'm sorry to say, with a chance individual, it might be a blessing that's even resented. Well, all I know is I grew up in a traditional Catholic school, and all I know is that I'm weird and I can't do what my friends can do. That's not the attitude to take. This is a pearl of great price, to be given the Catholic faith at a time when it's almost impossible to find, to be given a Catholic education when it's almost impossible to get a Catholic education from the schools. So we can't be indifferent. Our Lord says, and this applies to all of us, to whom more is given, more is expected, and it's the place of the priest to really talk about that to you more than I would. But the need for respectful resistance continues. A recognition to fight for the faith continues, and what really continues is the need to understand, in the words of G.K. Chesterton, that orthodoxy, that love of the faith, that a militant counter-revolutionary defense of the faith is the greatest adventure of one's life. And this is the type of thing we're going to talk about in the fifth and sixth lectures of this series, whenever it is that I come back. The greatest adventure of life, dedication and battle joy. So thank you for your attention. This recording is produced by Oltyn Library Services. Visit us on the web at www.oltyn.org. That's www.oltyn.org, oltyn.org, or write to us at Oltyn Library Services, 2316 Delaware Avenue, PMB 325, Buffalo, New York, 14216. Please check our website or ask for our catalog of traditional Catholic cassettes, CDs, and DVDs.